My name is Bill McGlattery, and I'm the Director of Hotel Operations for Town Pump. And yes, we do operate hotels, and if you're unaware of that, I'll introduce you to our Director of Sales. And I've been on the Chamber Board for approximately 4 years now, and I'm really excited that this year I get to be the Vice President of Government Relations. And 2017 was an eventful year for the Montana Legislature. In addition to the regular session, these panelists and their colleagues put their normal lives on hold once again to resolve a budget crisis in November. It was an important first year for the Montana Chamber's 10-year strategic plan, Envision 2026. Through legislative and private sector initiatives, the Chamber is focused on making measurable progress in our 4 critical areas: workforce development, business climate, infrastructure investment, and entrepreneurial sustainability. We look forward to advancing this plan as the interim continues and into the 2019 legislative session. With that, I'd like to welcome everyone to our long-standing Eggs and Issues breakfast, when we have the opportunity to hear from Montana's legislative leadership on all things legislative, electoral, and may I say political. I know folks have already started breakfast, which is fine, but I'd like to pause for a moment of silence to think of those protecting and defending us around the world. Thank you. We always appreciate our Business Day sponsors who make this all possible, and we have just so many sponsors this year, which is outstanding. And so instead of reading them all off, they're on the tents on the tables and they're up on the screens, and we thank every sponsor for your assistance in making Business Days possible. You should also be aware that there's a $20 contribution requirement to the High School Business Challenge for anyone whose cell phone goes off during the session. So please be mindful of that and turn your cell phone off. If you don't, we know your number, we'll call you. We're looking for money. So I'm pleased that we have with us today Senate President Scott Sayles of District 35 in Bozeman. He has had a long career in the Montana legislature, having served in the House from 2003 to 2009, and then in the Senate since 2013. He is only the second Montanan in state history to be presiding officer of both the Senate and the House. We're also joined by House Minority Leader Jenny Eck, who served as Minority Whip of the House in 2015 and as a caucus leader in 2017. She has served House District 79 here in Helena since 2013. Last and certainly not least, we're happy to have Speaker Pro Tem Greg Hertz of House District 12 in Polson. Greg is a former Montana Chamber Board member, and Representative Hertz has served in the House since 2013. Senate Minority Leader John Sesso sends his regrets and best wishes to everyone who's unable to join us today. So please help me welcome all of our legislative leaders and thank them for the work they do in Montana. According to protocol, we'll start with Senator Sayles and then go to Representative Eck and close with Representative Hertz. After their remarks, we will open to questions from the floor. And our Government Affairs Director, Bridger Malum, is got the microphone and will be playing Phil Donahue again today. So, Senator Sayles, the floor is yours.
Well, I want to thank the Chamber for giving me an opportunity to come and speak again before you. I can't remember how many times it's been, but quite a few over the number of years I've been involved in the legislature, and it's always a privilege to get to talk to the people that, in my opinion, make it happen in the state of Montana and across our country. You guys are the individuals that create opportunities for people that want jobs, and I appreciate the work that you guys do in that area. Actually, I was a little surprised that I got invited to come and speak today because over the years I've been known to be a champion of business. I've always voted for lower taxes, less government regulation, a court system that treats everybody fairly. And I was surprised when I got the Chamber's report card this time that I got an F. A 55 or a 56, I think, is what I got from the chamber for my effort this time during the session. And what was kind of odd for me is those of you that know my record never voted for a tax increase, typically. Always voted for a smaller, less bloated government. Wanted smaller regulations so that you guys can compete fairly and succeed. And something's changed. Something's changed at the chamber that I know I haven't. I still vote the same way. But now, if you vote against tax increases and government interference, it appears that maybe you're not the champion of business that you once thought you were. So it's been a time for me to reflect a little bit about my 15 years at the legislature, and maybe I missed the boat somewhere along the line. I didn't get the memo, or I need to reevaluate where I'm at. But I think it's something that maybe the business people need to reflect upon, whether or not they've had a change of heart, and whether or not they want more government interference, or whether they want to go back to the old school that basically made the state of Montana great and America great on the world stage. The good news is that if you pick up today's paper, it looks like revenue's picking up, and I applaud the efforts that have been done in Washington, D.C. We've got a president that believes in the private sector, believes in resource development, believes in less regulation and lower taxes, and I think it's going to bear big fruit for the country. What we need are better and more jobs. The best health care program anybody can have is a decent job so they can buy their own insurance. I think these principles are well-founded. I think that they served the country well over the course of my lifetime and way before, and I think they will once again. And quite frankly, I'm under the opinion that the revenue problem that we have, I wouldn't call it a crisis, but and it's not even really a dip in revenue, it's just that revenue flatlined, or actually grew at 1%, and we spent more money than we should have. But I'm under the opinion that this tax cut that the feds have pushed through will generate more business opportunities and more income and more wealth, more taxpayers, and less burden on the taxpayers to provide social services. So with that, that's really all I have to say. I think the economic outlook is good. I applaud you guys for the work that you do. And I've got one more session left. 19 will be my last session. And I look forward to working with you in the future. So thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. Great to see all of you. I'm Representative Jenny Eck. I represent House District 79 here in Helena, so we're very close to my district, and it's always great to have visitors coming and staying in Helena. We love having you come. We were asked to look at this last session, talk about highlights, talk about what we wish we could have accomplished, and look at also what the Chamber is putting forward in your 2026 proposal. And I was looking over that last night and really impressed by the proposal that the Chamber's put forward. I think it's really helpful to all of us policymakers to have a clear sense from the business community about what your priorities are and how you want to get there. Looking at the 2017 session, I think there's a lot of accomplishments that we saw get across the finish line where Democrats really partnered well with the business community. On workforce development, we certainly prioritized K through 12 education, as we always do, and pushed a lot of bills to try to get better funding for K through 12 and higher education in the state. With not as much success as we would like, but certainly a voice in all of those committee rooms for education in the state. We were able to pass the Montana Promise Act to establish a program for tuition grants for students at two-year colleges. And we also passed the apprenticeship tax credit, which I know was highlighted in your report that was carried by Casey Schreiner, representative in my caucus. And that is focused on making sure that businesses who provide apprenticeships get a tax credit and a double tax credit if they are training veterans. And so it was great to get that across the finish line. We, have some other highlights that I think may not be initially obvious as to why I would bring them up in this forum, but I think it's important to talk about some of the larger systemic changes that we've made at the legislature, which will make our communities stronger and safer, which obviously benefits all of us. Stability, I think, is important for the business economy and climate. We passed a massive criminal justice reform package, something that we worked on across party lines to really look at, who are we putting in our state prisons, and are they the ones who need to be there, and making sure that we're helping folks who come back out of the prison to get back in the community and be tax-paying members of society again, that we're providing for community-based parole, and also that we're not putting people in prison who don't need to be there, who, if they can stay in the community and be functional and pay their debts to society, that they're doing that, and that we're not paying that tab at the state prison. So that's an entire package that came together, and I think over the long term will actually make significant improvements to the cost of our correction system in Montana. We invested in mental health, not as much as I would have liked, but started working towards grants for suicide prevention in our schools across the state. And we also passed a slew of bills looking at sexual assault in the state and addressing sexual assault with an understanding of sort of the scientific response of victims who may have a fright response as opposed to a fight response. So recognizing that, if a victim freezes, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are consenting. And so we worked on a comprehensive package of bills around sexual assault reform legislation, and got those through on a bipartisan measure. So those were all some positive highlights. I think the other one that is highlighted in the report put out by the Chamber is the BARSA, the Bridge Road Accountability and Safety Act, which we passed also on a bipartisan basis. And that is a long needed bill. It took a while to convince me that it was something we should do, but it became clear to me that we have not increased our gas tax in over 25 years, which meant that we were at risk of losing federal funds for highway improvements across the state, and that we had some of the most dangerous highways in the country in Montana. So now we are investing in our highway infrastructure, our bridge infrastructure, to make sure that our roads are safe and our bridges are safe, and in doing so, we're creating jobs in the process. So those are some things that I think were accomplished this last session. Obviously, one of the major disappointments for the session for me was not passing the infrastructure bill. That was our number one priority as a caucus, was to pass a comprehensive infrastructure package that would have provided for jobs across the state, and if it had passed, we'd be putting people to work right now on those important projects that are much needed in communities around the state. We were looking at rural water and sewer systems, repairs and upgrades to dozens of schools, improvements to MSU campuses in Bozeman, Billings, and Great Falls, a needed water intake in Laurel, improvements for Makoshika State Park near Glendive, and a loan to finally build a long-planned Southwestern Veterans Home in Butte. It's a frustrating thing for me that bill did not make it through. It had the majority of support in both houses, but as you probably know, since it was a bonding bill, we needed a supermajority to get it through. We got it through the Senate, we got it out of committee in the House, and we could not overcome the Republican leadership opposition, frankly, in the House. And so we came just a few votes shy of getting that through. And it's unfortunate because, as you know, interest rates were really low last year. It would have been the perfect time to pass a bill like that. It used to be that we would always pass bonding bills, just as a matter of course. The folks I've talked to who served 10, 20 years ago, it wasn't a partisan football. It was something that was just done. It was a recognition that we needed to invest in ourselves, invest in our state, create good paying jobs, and invest in our infrastructure and take pride in who we are as a state. And I think it's unfortunate that did not pass, but we will keep talking about that. I'm sure we'll have more opportunity to talk about it today, and I think it's important for you all to continue to make your voices heard as to why that matters to Montana. As you also know, we had a special session in November. The budget coming out of the regular session was not enough to make up for the shortfall that we faced, and so we did have to come back. And I'll point out that we have made significant cuts to state government and to funding for public services and education over the last year. And that comes on the heels of actually making cuts in 2013 and 2015 in terms of vacancy savings and other cuts. So this past session alone, we made $196 million in cuts, and then this special session, an additional $76 million in cuts. And I bring that to your attention because I think it's important to understand what some of the impacts of those cuts are and how those will impact our communities potentially. We have seen, cuts to K through 12, as I've mentioned, cuts to higher education. We have seen cuts to provider reimbursement rates for providing disability services for people across the state. We are going to see an impact on in-home care for the elderly as a result of these cuts. And I think it's also worth saying that when we don't fund these things at the state level, they oftentimes have an impact on the local level, on property taxpayers in our counties. And so it's a trade-off that is one that is painful for our local communities. And I'm sure you can agree with me that property taxes are tough right now, that folks who are working across the state are struggling with property taxes. And when we, as a state are not adequately funding, for example, our prison system, or we don't have enough judges to hear cases in a timely manner, that impacts us on the local level. I know here in Lewis and Clark County, we have a backed up county jail because folks are waiting even for a hearing and they're being held in jail until they're heard and they're not being moved through quickly. As you know as well, when we don't have adequate judges across the state, we don't have an adequate number of judges, criminal cases and family cases are given priority over civil cases. So when businesses need to get before a court to deal with a legal issue, they're going to get bumped to the back of the line if we don't have adequate numbers of judges in the state. So I've been, thinking more and more systemically especially in the last few months, as I've been looking at the budget, the impacts of the budget in Montana, and where we're potentially headed as a state. And I think, both on a national and a state level, it's important that we think about systems. When we talk about strong economies and strong businesses, we can't have those without strong workforce, a healthy and educated workforce. We can't have that without communities where people want to move back. We talk a lot about how we don't want our young people to leave Montana. And I would say it's pretty normal for young people to initially leave, right? I mean, my kids are already saying that they want to go to college out of state, and they're young, but that's just normal. But what we hope is that they'll come back, and they'll bring their families back, and that they'll settle down here, and they'll raise their kids here, and they'll buy a home here, and they'll start a business here. Obviously, good paying jobs are critical to that, but that's not enough. We also need communities where there's access to open space, where we have a great education system, where we have good health care, where there's arts, where there's things to do, where we have so much in Montana, we can't take it for granted, we need to protect it, and we need to make sure that our communities are places where people want to move, where we're bringing entrepreneurs in and investors in, and I think we have the potential to do that. We just can't lose sight of these larger systems and these larger, I would say the canary in the coal mine in any economy, in any community, is how is the working class doing? How are working folks doing? Are they healthy? Are they educated? Are they able to meet their dreams? Are they able to pursue their dreams? Those are the questions we need to be asking, and I think it's incumbent upon all of us, whether we're in government or in business or in nonprofits, to be thinking about those things. I'll just close by saying that, and as I know we'll have lots more time to talk, but my grandfather is 92 years old. He's a World War II veteran who served in the Pacific Theater and was at Iwo Jima. And he's one of the people who was closest to me and who raised me as a child. And one of the things that he often talks about is the impact of the GI Bill on him and on our family. Because of the GI Bill, a man who grew up in a poor family during the Great Depression, who lived on a farm and whose family had not gone to college, was able to go to college, was able to go to medical school, was able to go back and become a specialist. He became a plastic surgeon and started the first burn unit working on skin grafts in the hospital in the community where I grew up. And he often says that it's access to that education that changed the entire trajectory of not only his life, but our entire family's life, where he went on to have, with my grandmother, 4 children who all went to college and all went on to get advanced degrees and had successful professions, and all of his grandchildren who went on to college. So I think it's really critical, and I know this is something that you all recognize and have highlighted in your report, that we be thinking about how are we making sure that the next generation has as good or better opportunities than we do. And I can't think of anything more important than that. I think we're all committed to that, and I know that my caucus wants to be a partner with you in ways that we can continue to find creative ways going forward to make sure that we're making for healthy communities and a healthy future for our state. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting us here today. And you know, it's been great. The best thing about today is I get to drive home tonight. I won't be driving up to the Capitol and spending the next 4 months up there. It's fantastic that we only meet every other year in Montana here as citizen legislators. You know, it's difficult. You know, we take time away from our businesses and our families and come up here and try to get things accomplished to better the state. Envision 2026. What is that? I mean, just ask Bridger. I mean, he constantly reminds us about every committee meeting, everywhere we're at, talks about how this fits into Envision 2026. And you know, if you haven't had time to go to the Chamber's website and look at the brochures and on there, it's an excellent plan. And as mentioned by Bill in the beginning, I did serve on the Chamber board for a while, and I think they've made a long improvement here on this particular plan. It looks like a good plan and that everybody can get behind. What I'd really encourage the Chamber and the business community to do is look at your plan and see how it does work into improving the Montana economy and reducing government. But start working on bills now. You need to get some bills drafted. You need to come talk to legislative leaders this summer and be ready for when the session rolls around in 19, because you know, that short window of when we get elected in the first part of November, and then we're right into the session starting on January. Very short window to get prepared. As Senator Sales mentioned too, I was quite surprised by my scorecard. I had a 72 out of the Chamber scorecard this year. I've always been a champion of business in the high 90s, if not close to 100. There was a few bills that we just did not agree on this year. But in regards to the 17 session, it's always hard to kind of recall what happened in those 90 days. I mean, it's just you know, one day after another, moving on from one issue to the next issue. But one thing, as Representative Eck had mentioned about some of the cuts, well, some of us look at cuts differently. As a business owner, when I think of a cut, I'm thinking that, hey, I spent less money this year than I spent last year. But you know, a lot of folks look at cuts as cuts to increases. So, I mean, our budget's still increasing, even though we did have to make some reductions. And if you look at, and people talk about our budget, you know, our issues with our budget, and yeah, we do have some issues, but keep in mind, even with the governor's office, their projections in revenue, we're still projecting a revenue growth of 7.5% over the biennium. I think any business owner would easily love to have a 7.5% increase in their revenues over the next couple of years. So we really need to look at the spending side of the ledger also, and make sure that we're spending the monies in the right places, finding efficiencies in government, and getting those dollars working for the people of Montana. I think one of the biggest things that came out of the legislature was the creation of a budget stabilization reserve fund for the state of Montana going forward. Most states have this type of fund. We've always just had our ending fund or a rainy day fund, which is basically just extra cash that's sitting there available that the executive can just grab and use as revenue moves up and down. But with this budget stabilization fund, there'll be some constraints on the executive. And he'll have to make some tough decisions when he can go in and grab those dollars. And when we get to a certain point, when he takes some monies out of the budget stabilization reserve fund, he'll have to make cuts for dollars that he takes out. And if we would have had that in place in 2015, we would not be in the budget crisis that we're currently in. Because when we got to the session at the beginning of 17, our rainy day fund was basically non-existent. So we didn't have any cash to kind of help offset and move some of the, when revenue dipped, to fill in some holes where we had to. I think one of the other big victories in the 17 legislative session was the defeat of over $200 million in new tax increases. You know, I just don't see the need to balance our budget on the backs of the citizens of Montana without first really looking at exploring the inefficiencies that we have in government. Another issue that's really dear to my heart is the aquatic invasive species issue. Of course, representing the southern end of Flathead Lake. We just can't let those mussels expand across the state of Montana. They can do some detriment to not only our recreation areas, but farmers and ranchers, to their irrigation systems, and not only that, but to the hydropower that we have in this state. Some of the disappointments, well, it's always hard to recall. There's a lot of individual bills that weren't passed that I was disappointed in. But I think one of the biggest disappointments was House Bill 8, which was a loan program that comes out of our coal trust fund, which we've always done. It is loans to major irrigation projects across the state of Montana. And that bill was defeated. That takes a real supermajority on that particular issue. That bill was primarily defeated mainly because the other bonding bills we talked about. I think it was just somewhat out of spite that some legislators just felt that, no, we're not going to pass that bill. And then I guess another disappointment was the revenue estimate. I mean, it's difficult to estimate our revenue at the state, particularly when we meet from January to April. The majority of our revenue comes in, and we know where it comes in after income tax returns are filed. So we need to get past the April 15th deadline to really have an idea as to things, how they look and how it's progressing. And so we'll always kind of struggle with our revenue estimate. I think the only other way we could probably have a better estimate is maybe move the session and meet from February to the end of May. And that would allow us to see more revenues come in, but it's always difficult to looking at that change. But due to the fact that we did miss the revenue estimate, which our staff works hard on, and our bipartisan staff, our nonpartisan staff, I should say, it was difficult, and of course that then resulted in the special session that we had to deal with. So. I guess I'll just leave it at that. I mean, there's many other things we could talk about, but I would, as always at events, I usually just prefer to answer questions that's on people's minds. So thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, legislators, for those opening remarks. And now, as Representative Hurt said, he looks forward to answering questions. So if you have your questions, raise your hand, and Bridger will be around with the microphone. This is...
Thanks for being here. Daryl James, Executive Director for the Montana Infrastructure Coalition. I think most business people in the room, and certainly members of our coalition, appreciate and understand your concerns about growth in government and regulatory burdens. And it's something that I think that House Bill 473, the fuel tax increase, it called for greater transparency, greater accountability in how our highway dollars are spent, called for an audit of the Department of Transportation, called for an audit of the Department of Transportation to make sure that we were identifying opportunities for greater efficiencies in the way we're spending those dollars. But when we looked at the way we made this country and this state great was by investing in that basic critical infrastructure. And as I look at our investment as a percentage of GDP, we're declining. So my question on not just highway spending, but basic critical infrastructure, roads, bridges, water, sewer, what's the trigger point for the legislature in reinvesting in that critical infrastructure at a reasonable level?
You know, we spent a lot of money on infrastructure in this session, and we could have spent more if House Bill 8 would have passed. We spend hundreds of millions of dollars, not only at the state level, but at the county and at the city level. So I would argue that we do a good job in that area. If our roads and bridges were as bad as you and others claim, I would have constituents across my district that runs all the way from North Gallatin County to the southern, to the border with Cascade County. I'd have people complaining. They aren't. What I hear about is that they can't afford their insurance premiums, and that I hear about that their property taxes are too high. And I hear about all kinds of different issues, but I typically don't hear about that we need more state buildings and that we need more collaboration between the private sector and the public sector. I actually abhor the corporate welfare more than I do the social safety net. Business is business. It's not government. Government doesn't provide any jobs. I mean, you have to take money from the private sector for the public sector to do anything. And thus it gains control of both. Not only the person that gives the money, but the person that receives it. So I would argue that Montana was built on rugged individualism, that people came out here without a government program. They came out here wanting to be free of government interference. They wanted to establish something, a dream of their own. And we need to get back to that. Less government means a more robust private sector that provides the jobs and the opportunities for people to succeed. I have never worked for a poor person. Just hasn't happened. I guess we just have a fundamentally difference of opinion. But we are spending a lot of money on infrastructure. We're going to continue to spend a lot of money on infrastructure. It is important, I agree with you, but it isn't the end-all, be-all of all things.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Daryl. And as Scott pointed out, yeah, we do spend a lot of money on infrastructure across the state on various programs. Although I did not support the gas tax increase, I thought we could find some efficiencies in the Department of Transportation. But one thing I did like that did come out of that bill was the audit provisions in the performance. I think we really need to look at the Department of Transportation, and I believe in that bill it's going to compare us to some other states, see how they're operating their departments, and see where we can go from there. I think you look at, we have a number of engineers on staff at the Montana Department of Transportation, which is higher than I believe a lot of other states have gone to contracting engineers. So always kind of a question, what do a lot of these engineers do at the Department of Transportation during our non-construction season, which lasts very long here in Montana. But I think one thing that goes on up at the Capitol is we try to solve problems on the short term. We really don't have long-term solutions. And if we're going to have some type of infrastructure constant investment, we need a revenue stream. We need to identify, okay, if we're going to issue some bonds, which we haven't issued any bonds for some time. I think it was probably prior to the Schweitzer administration, the last time we actually had a bonding bill. We've always kind of put some cash aside in various accounts and done a lot of projects. But if we are going to get in some bonding, the only way I can support bonding would be have a revenue stream, just like any other business was. How am I going to pay for those yearly payments on those bonds? Because if we pass a bonding bill in a particular session, oh, great, so we build $50 million. What are we going to do the next session? Who are going to be the winners and losers? So we need to have a plan, and I think using our long-range building plan, which we have there, we just need to have some sources if we're going to go down that road.
I think, I guess I already touched on that, I felt that passing BARSA was the right thing to do. I think it made a lot of sense to be making that investment in our state, and certainly would have been very foolhardy to lose those federal funds. We have obviously a very high number of highway miles in our state, and so we stand a lot to gain from leveraging those funds and a lot to lose if we don't. And certainly we owe it to the people of our state. We know statistically, like I said, we have had the second highest fatality rate on our highways. So we know it's been bad. We know we need to do something. It's just not acceptable. So I think, on the question of bonding, to me, it does not make sense to not take advantage of very low interest rates. It's just a common sense thing that we would be driving our economic engine by investing in infrastructure, and that we will see actually revenue from those workers getting out there working, and from the benefits to businesses across the state. So I think it's unfortunate that we have gotten to a place in our state for some reason where suddenly that is not seen as something we can all agree on. It used to be something we agreed on. It's something that we worked on a bipartisan fashion, and we moved projects forward that benefited communities across the state, rural and urban, north and south, east and west. One of the struggles that we had from our caucus with the way that things went forward with the infrastructure packages was this sort of prioritizing of some communities' projects and the dismissal of the importance of projects in other communities. And we really have to get away from that. We really have to recognize that urban areas in Montana do have different needs than rural areas. When you have an urban area, you have a tax base that is able to pay for roads and sewers in a way that is not as easy for rural communities. And so rural communities might need help with that from the state in a way that urban areas don't. But urban areas, on the other hand, we have projects that we need help with, and certainly making sure that we're investing in our university system is one of those priorities that we are really focused on in some of these more urban communities. And so we're determined to not continue to pit communities against each other, but to look at things holistically for the state of Montana. And that's just the way it is. We just are going to have to start throwing down on that, because if we don't, we just continue to see some communities get left out in the cold while others get prioritized.
We have another question over here.
Thanks, Bridger. And thank you all for being so articulate before 8 o'clock in the morning. That's impressive. Jen Hensley from Pacific Source. I wanted to touch a bit on the cuts that occurred, and also the more cuts that probably Senator Sales certainly wants to see in state government. I think we can all think of examples of places where, as common sense citizens and leaders of industry, we can see government maybe bloated a bit. I see fishing access sites in remote locations that are neatly mowed in the middle of September. And so I'm like, well, that money could probably be better spent elsewhere. But as you well know, the majority of the pot that you have to cut is corrections, education, and human services, right? So those general fund revenues. When we're looking at, during this interim and probably into the next legislative session, the tax structure of our state and the revenue structure of our state, how much focus is going to be spent on special revenue dollars and your access to trim some of those versus the general fund? And just contributing to that, I would encourage you to keep in mind that when reimbursement rates are cut to our provider partners across the state, then commercial insurance rates do see a bump, because there is cost shifting that occurs. And so I would just encourage you to keep that in mind and reach out to us for any information you need on that.
A particular question in there, Jen? Well, thank you for the question. I think, you need to look at everything. I mean, yeah, we've got general fund dollars, and we have special revenue fund dollars. For those of you who aren't in the legislature, those are kind of dollars that are put aside in a special account and just used for certain purposes. But sometimes we need to look at those special revenue accounts and reallocate them for other uses. I think one of the perfect examples right now is the Tobacco Settlement Trust Fund, which constitutionally it was passed to put into certain accounts and only spent on certain areas. I think we really need to look at those dollars and making sure that we're spending those properly and in the right places. Or, there's some dollars that we could basically shift probably to some human services programs. So
Greg's probably heard me say this a dozen times, but you can hear me say it one more time. I push back on the idea that we have, foregone tax increases in the Montana State Legislature. We made, those bills that have been brought forward to increase revenue on the state level may have been killed, but I will say that there's a cost shift onto property taxpayers around the state. And so I think before anyone pats themselves on the back too much, I think we have to look at what are the costs of these cuts that are being made. What is the impact when we are cutting K through 12 education, when we are cutting higher education, when we are forcing folks to pass levies to pay for their expanding jail needs because the state is not adjudicating people properly? What does it cost to a family when they have to pay higher tuition? I would say that's a tax. I would say it's a tax when someone's elder care is cut and then the family has to figure out how they're going to care for their elderly parent. I would say it's a tax when someone's disability care is cut and then they have to figure out how they're going to pay for that. I mean, that is fundamentally difficult for working families across the state to make it day to day when they're facing those kinds of challenges. And so I think we have to look, like I said, holistically at what are the costs of the decisions we're making and what are the long-term costs and how are those going to impact our economic future in the state? And it's, we just have to start asking those hard questions. It's really hard to talk about taxes. No politician wants to talk about taxes. And yet here we are having to talk about taxes. And it's probably long past time that we look at our tax structure in the state and really figure out what is fair, how do we go forward without continuing to find ourselves in situations like we did this year. We've made some adjustments and we talked about the Budget Stabilization Act, but I have real concerns going into next session. I'll just throw it out there that Medicaid expansion is up for renewal this coming session, and I know for many folks in this room that has been something that's been really important. It's been a priority. It certainly is for me, and I think it's critical to our rural access hospitals. It's critical to the health care of our workforce, and we're going to have to figure out what we're going to do about that next session. So along with all the other challenges that we're facing with our budget, I mean, that's a very real concern and a very real need in this state, and the success of that program in terms of how many people we have been able to insure and the life-changing effect that has had across the state, I think is hard to underestimate. And so when I look forward, I think about that and how does that interplay with the budget as it stands now and with revenue. None of these are easy questions or easy answers, but I would just challenge all of us to start thinking about these questions in a more complex way, because I think we have to get beyond sort of, tax cuts are good and, cutting government is good, and it's just sort of this very simple way of looking at it. When you look more closely at it, the ripple effects of these kinds of decisions can go on for generations, and I think we owe it to ourselves to think about it in a more complex way.
Just real quickly, I would say that government's alive and well. In the 15 years I've been involved in the legislature, the budget's more than doubled. Once again, every dollar you take out of the private sector and you put into the public sector is one less dollar that you can spend on plant, equipment, personnel. That's where the jobs are at. That's where, as you well know, the people in the private sector are the individuals that make things work. And a rising tide lifts all ships. I know that's just a great cliche, but I don't have constituents asking me to raise their taxes, whether it be their gas tax or whether it be their property tax. And one thing I will say about when property taxes do go up, and they have gone up, mine went up 17% this time. Well, they voted, the people of Gallatin County voted in the Bozeman area, they voted in a mill levy increase for a $80 or $100 million high school. I guess they wanted higher property taxes. They had the chance to turn it down. So I don't have a lot of sympathy for them. I voted no. But apparently, I was on the losing end of that vote, and I'm used to being on the losing end of a lot of votes. So I'm not worried about government. Government somehow just continues to thrive. What I'm worried about is the private sector, where things happen and good things happen. And I think we need more focus on that, and I don't mean a government handout. We need to create an environment where people can compete or fail on their own merit, and I would argue that I can't. My mind doesn't work that a service provided to an individual, if they have to pay more for something that they want, is a tax. You know? If you want to go to college, that's your responsibility or the family's responsibility. That's never been the government's responsibility until recently. And there's just so many other things. I mean, healthcare is not a fundamental right. I mean, I'm sure it'll probably get written up in the paper that I'm some sort of mean ogre, but I would love to have somebody show me in the U.S. Constitution where it's a fundamental right that you have healthcare. It's a blessing. It's a privilege. It's a nice thing to have. I'd like to have healthcare when I need it, but the bottom line is I'm not owed it. And so we continually think and add that these things like an education is a fundamental right, a higher education. That's a privilege. And I feel very privileged to have been able to go to college. And there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of ways to provide an education for people to go that want to go. They can get the GI Bill. There's Pell Grants. There's all kinds of student loans. In fact, we have a $1.3 trillion worth of student loan debt. But things have changed so much in my lifetime. I feel like that I'm not even really in touch with, to some degree, with what goes on out there. When I went to college, we drank Hamp's beer. Now they drink microbrews by the gallon at $5.50 a pint. When I went to college, a vacation was to get a fishing license or buy a brick of 22 shells and go out and shoot it up. Now they go to Cabo San Lucas or they go down to the Yucatan, of which I've never been to. But people need. But those are the type of decisions that you make when someone else is paying the freight. When I paid the freight, I made better decisions. If someone else is paying the freight and they're paying for my health care, guess what? I'm not going to be as good a steward of those dollars as if it was coming out of my pocket. So, I'm not an anti-government person. We need a strong government that provides for certain things to allow us to go about our lives. But I resist this idea that government needs to be this cradle-to-grave entitlement system that somehow we all benefit from. And in my opinion, it's a bankrupt idea.
I got a question over here, but want to see a show of hands so I can get around the room, too. If there's other questions I can be looking out for. All right, well, be thinking of them in the meantime here.
Good morning. Thank you for your service this morning, as well as the legislative session and the special sessions. I'm Sheila Rice. I'm a volunteer with the Montana Housing Coalition. Thank you, Representative Sales, for letting us know you drank Hamm's. It explains a lot. I want to tag on what Representative Hertz and Representative Eck had to say about looking at more of a longer range horizon and a plan for Montana. And I, of course, as a representative of the Housing Coalition, would love to see housing in that plan somehow. But how do we get there? Is there a possibility that we leave these 2-year increments that we work on so much? Wasn't much difference when I was in the sessions in 91 and 93, but how do we work toward that longer range plan that's the plan for Montana that's workable in the future?
Thanks for the question. I won't try to fudge. I don't know a lot about housing policy, so I don't want to pretend that I do. I know that resort communities have obviously figured out ways to provide for housing, lower income housing, just because they, for folks who are coming into work in these resort communities, they can't afford oftentimes to live in those communities, and so there's been ways that we've seen some of those communities do a local tax, a resort tax, to pay for housing. But it is a challenge. I mean, you look at the cost of housing in Bozeman, and it just blows my mind how much people have to pay to live in a community of Bozeman. And Missoula isn't far behind it. So, and even Helena, it gets tough for folks to be able to invest in a home. So I know that it's a challenge, and I think it's something that we have, looked at the legislature and just kind of keep coming up against sort of roadblocks of how to proceed. So it's going to take, more work with the communities and more work with folks like you who are experts, because I I don't have a silver bullet.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with Jenny on some of those points. A lot of issues in regards to housing are more local government issues. I know in a lot of communities, take Missoula for example, and I know a little bit more about Missoula since my son, Representative Adam Hertz, is a real estate developer there and served on the Missoula City Council for 4 years. But some of the roadblocks that some of our local governments have put up and the additional cost to building a house hasn't helped in some of those communities with the different rules and regulations. But in regard to your other part of the question, and you talked about some of the short-term planning that the legislature has always done, I'm not sure how we can get into a little bit more of a longer range outlook on some of our issues, although I think the business community can certainly help in coming and working together with the legislature and making sure you show up and talk to your legislators instead of just waiting until you have a particular issue that is a thorn in your side and you might contact us. So we are a citizen legislature in Montana, and we need more input from folks. But and I think one of the things that's coming up in this interim, of course, we're going to have a study just looking at our tax structure and see whether it still makes sense in Montana. And of course, we all know what's happened with our Montana economy and losing a lot of our natural resource jobs, particularly in western Montana. Timber was always a mainstay over there, which it is not anymore. And so we have this tourism service type economy, and what does our tax structure need to look like to support that? And I think it's something we really need to look at here going forward.
I don't have a whole lot more to offer there. I'd probably just fall back on the answer I gave you a year ago when we were right in the same room right before the 2017 session. Yeah, Bozeman has extremely high housing costs, and quite a bit of it can be attributed to the city council that wants to have high impact fees, the open space that everybody likes, trail systems, what type of boulevard trees that you can plant, what type of siding you can have on your house, what color it's going to be, and yada, 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 yada. I mean, the more regulations and the more, restrictions you can put on people, and we don't want to have trailer courts for crying out loud because they don't look good. That doesn't present the right type of image that we're going to want for Gallatin County and for Bozeman in particular. We've lost affordable housing because we've lost some of the trailer courts that are there. Once again, you get what you pay for. If you want all these pretty things and all these amenities, they cost money. And that drives up the cost of housing. So take it up with the city council.
We'll have some time for more questions. Any takers? All right, well, I over here. Great.
Keep it short. I will. Would the legislature consider a sales tax? I mean, all of you, nobody ever wants to talk about it, but I mean, I'm a huge consumer. I'd pay a ton in sales tax. And that seems like the fairest tax. If you're using something, you'd pay the tax. So I'd just like to hear what you have to say.
I'll take that one first. I'm not running for re-election, so hell yes, let's have a sales tax. I don't know if it'll probably never happen, but yeah, I think when you have 10, 11 million visitors coming to the state and there's 1 million of us and they all have sales taxes somewhere else, I think it's insane that we don't have a sales tax. But I'm not a three-legged stool type guy because I know what government does when they have extra money. They just grow government some more. So what I'd like to do is go to more of like the Wyoming model, and let's get rid of income tax, let's get a sales tax, and I think the economy would boom, even more so than I think it potentially will going forward. So, I'm not afraid to talk about it, but I'm not running for re-election. So these two people here that have an election coming up later this year, they might be a little less reluctant to endorse it. But yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense for our state when you consider the amount of people that come here and that visit the state, that we aren't getting more than a bed tax and a rental car tax out of them. And I agree with you. I think it's one of the fairest taxes, and probably enough said.
I agree with Senator Sales. I am running for re-election, but I have supported sales taxes out there, and I know Representative White's in the audience right now. He had a sales tax bill to replace property taxes. I really like that bill. It's difficult to administer. I hate property taxes. Why should you have to rent your property from the government? I mean, you work your life, try to pay for your property, and just want to be left alone, and yet you constantly have to pay this rent on your property to the government to live in it. I had a bill that I introduced, or I did not introduce it. I had to draft it mainly to get a fiscal note to see what the impact, so we could start this discussion. My bill was a sales tax on retail and services to replace our income taxes, because I do like the Wyoming model, the South Dakota model, and some of the other states. I look at an income tax as more of a punitive tax. I mean, you're discouraging people from out there from working, and I do truly believe that consumption taxes, like a sales tax, are a better form of taxation. Particularly in our changing economy now, we're more of a service and tourism economy, which lends to a sales tax. And we need to continue with that discussion as we go forward and looking at our overall tax structure. And I'm in the retail business, and we all know how popular Amazon is in online sales, and these people are selling into all the states. The only way we're going to be able to actually tax those is through a sales tax, and it's pretty difficult for us brick and mortar retailers to compete with those individuals and sending products into our state. So it's a discussion we need to have, and I'm not afraid to talk about that.
Unsurprisingly, probably I would oppose a sales tax. My fundamental issue with it is it's regressive. If we're going to be hitting folks who are going to the grocery store and putting their school clothes on their kids in the fall and buying new lunch boxes and all the things that working folks need to buy, it's going to hit them. It's going to hit them in a way that's going to affect their ability to provide for their families. And I just think there's other better ways we can do it. I mean, we had multiple proposals on the table this session that I think get at the fundamental unfairness of our tax code in Montana. One example is that folks making over $1 million in capital gains, we looked at asking them to pay the same as someone pays for income tax, for what they pay on their wages. And we couldn't get it out of committee. But the reality is that someone who's making over $1 million on capital gains is paying a lower income tax or a lower tax rate than someone who works for a living. That just doesn't make sense to me. We have, a single mom making $18,000 is paying the same income tax rate as a multimillionaire in this state. It's all the same tax rate. That doesn't make sense to me. We look at companies that are putting part of their money offshore, and we've looked at trying to have them pay a higher tax rate as a penalty for deciding to move their money. There's a lot of things that we can look at that would hit tourists harder than local folks, would hit tourists harder than Montanans, and I think that makes a ton of sense. A lot of these folks who are coming from out of state are used to paying taxes back home. They're paying 9-10% in some of these states, so they don't even blink if they come here and they would pay a tax on lodging or a tax on rental cars. And I think we should look to those kinds of things before we would look to an across-the-board sales tax that would hit working families in the state on their bottom line and their bottom line budget of what they're able to provide for their families every month. I think we can do better than that. I think there's a lot of creative ideas out there. I mean, one other that I'll mention that came to our attention during special session is that the fees that stockbrokers pay in Montana have not been adjusted since the 80s. And most of these stockbroker licenses are coming out of Wall Street. These Wall Street stockbrokers have to be licensed in every state. more than 90% of those licenses are issued to out-of-staters. And that, if we had just brought it up to current, just inflationary increases, that would have brought in $18 million. So there's things we can be doing that we just need to be willing to look at and willing to talk about. And I would certainly want to look at a lot of those kinds of ideas before we would look at hitting families on their bottom line.
All right, well, I have, I guess, a quick comment and then a question, too. It's no surprise to anybody in this room who read our last scorecard that the Bridge and Road Safety and Accountability Act, House Bill 473, was our highest valued bill. And we did that for a reason. We felt that infrastructure was really important to address in this last legislative session. We were able to accomplish that. And I'll tell you, it's guided so much, this Envision 2026 plan, by our members, that we were directed to go this route because we had to do something. And frankly, I feel like, as the Montana Chamber, we're not, against a revenue enhancer, a modest one, that we feel is for a defined purpose that can also, in its own way, too, help the private sector, in this case, commerce. And on that note, too, we are undergoing our own tax study, and we want to work in conjunction with what you guys in the legislature are doing too, because that's very important to us. We feel that there's still a lot of unfairness for the business community in the taxes that they're paying. But on the taxes note, I wanted to get your thoughts specifically on the Department of Revenue's estimates that came out recently about the concept of a possible special session to deal with what are estimated on certain assumptions to be a huge upcoming budget hole, if folks want to comment on that.
Well, the governor has all the tools he currently needs to balance the budget, right in statute. So I encourage him to do that. And in terms of this budget or this decrease in revenue because of the federal thing, the last thing I want to do is for the feds to say, hey, we're going to cut your taxes, and then for the state, and in particular the Republicans, to turn around and say, and we're going to increase them for you. So it 46 million bucks is the last number that I saw. I don't know if it's changed. He's got the authority to make adjustments to the budget. I encourage him to do so. If he chooses to call us back, I would hope he'd give us more than a week's notice to get to Helena and put some patch on this thing. It's not a crisis. We have time, and it would be, I think it would behoove the whole process just to have more time than a week to come to Helena, and I would resist that. But I don't think I'm not convinced we still needed a special session last fall, and I'm certainly not convinced we need one right away. If we're going to make major changes to the tax code, I think that requires some vetting, and it needs some public input, and it needs to be thought about, and it needs to be analyzed. And I just don't think a special session is the time to make fairly substantial changes to the revenue formula. So. And once again, I think that better revenue numbers are going to come in over 2018. Might be wrong, but that's my bet. So I would resist a special session, and I'll turn it over to Representative Hertz.
Yeah, I would agree with Senator Sales, and we've seen that number coming from Director Cadis in the Department of Revenue jumping all over the place. And currently we're down to $40-some million, which there's some major disagreements on that. The Tax Foundation's looked at it and is basically saying the Montana Department of Revenue is not accurate in their interpretation of the tax law as it has passed. And I would concur with that, serving on House Taxation Committee, and I'm also a CPA, so I have a little bit of knowledge of taxation. But and just looking at where this federal tax cut might lead us. You know, we're talking about an $800 million, up to an $800 million tax cut for Montanans on their federal taxes. We only collect about 1.1 billion in state taxes. It's almost a 65 to 70% reduction. If you look at it towards like our state taxes, there's a lot of money. $800 million is going to help the Montana economy. And that has not even been taken into consideration of some of these projections. I think it's premature to call us in for a special session. And as Senator Sales said, I would hope we have a little more than a week's notice. I think the governor may have realized that the last special session probably didn't quite turn out the way he had wished it had. And so we'll do what we need to do, but it's premature right now to call us back to Helena. And in fact, we just got our revenue estimate update yesterday. Numbers are looking better. HJ2 for fiscal year 18, when we came to the special session, the governor's office was projecting a downturn of $137 million for fiscal 18. The current revenue estimate is looking at that decrease only somewhere in the $52 million range. I talked to legislative services staff, and they think it's somewhere in that 50 to 70. So it's revenues have improved. We'll know much more as we progress in the next few months, and especially as we get through the April filing deadline for state income taxes to see the direction we're headed.
Yeah, I do think it's premature. We don't know what the final numbers are going to be. We know it'll be the tens of millions of dollars, but you know, in defense of the Department of Revenue, this is a 500-page bill that was rammed through at the end of the year, right before Christmas, and it's complicated and it has significant impacts, and I think it's going to be unclear probably for a little while what the actual impacts are going to be. I would also point out that while the federal government managed to pass a 500-page bill with very little public input very quickly before Christmas, we still don't have a budget that's been finalized, and we don't know whether CHIP's going to be funded or how. And so obviously, children's health insurance has a state of impact. We've been able to float along on children's health insurance, just trying to make sure we keep people covered, but it creates instability certainly in our budget, and we don't yet know what's going to happen with that. So there's a lot of questions to be answered. I think that it is worth pointing out that, you know, yes, the governor has the tools to make cuts without the legislature coming in, but he can only cut from the general fund. And so really that he's limited to cutting from corrections and health and human services and education. And so it's not as easy as it might sound, especially when you've cut to the bone like we have. So I think, you know, if we can limp along through this year, especially if revenue ticks up, we will be certainly limping into next session, and we will have to ask ourselves some tough questions. But I don't think anyone up here is anxious to go back. I know we would all prefer to not have to, so we'll hope for the best.
Okay, well, to all three of you, thank you for the very interesting and informative program and information. We greatly appreciate that you've joined us here this morning and your service to the state of Montana as legislators, as we appreciate every legislator and their time and contributions to our state. So can we have a round of applause for these legislators? And we have